one of the things that's really interesting and unique about the country is that it's produced the right leaders at the right moments, almost providentially. Dwight Eisenhower was a lieutenant colonel in the Army in 1939 who hadn't been promoted in 13 years. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president, William Tecumseh Sherman wrote a letter to a close friend saying the country's doomed. This guy was a backwoods barbarian who was completely not up to the task. When Lincoln passed away, when Lincoln was murdered, Sherman recollected that he was the greatest man of any that he had ever known, and he had met all of the great men of the world by that point, or the ones that were described as such. So I think it's a character test where it reveals itself. So, for example, I was having a conversation and someone asked me a question about Gretchen Whitmer, from Michigan, and that person was excited about Governor Whitmer, about being a presidential candidate and running, and asked me about her. And I said, well, I think she'd be a great candidate if she wanted to do it. Do you know anything about her? Does she want to be the president? Because just because you become the governor of Michigan or New Jersey or some state shouldn't necessarily follow that you want to be the president. I mean, because being the governor of one of these states and running these races is like being a commercial airline pilot. Running for president's like being an astronaut. The two things literally have almost nothing to do with one another. And so, like, on the first hand, like, I reject the idea that the only people who are qualified in American life for the big job are senators, governors, members of Congress. I think that's a big mistake. I think we need people to be involved in public service. We need someone to call people to public service. We need someone to approach all this stuff with some idealism. You need someone who can communicate, talk, has conviction, knows what they want to do, wants to accomplish something, and is fearless about losing, right? Wants to run because they believe in something and will let the chips fall where they may. And that's the type of person that you want to see rise up and get into this. This is the country has a deep wealth of talented people, and some of those people, right, need to be involved in running the country, right, in public service. It can't be ceded, right, to the strangest, the most deluded, and the craziest amongst us. It's not going to work out. And so everybody, looks around, who's going to fix it? Who's the magic person? There is no magic person. We have to fix it. People have to be involved in their communities, in their civic life. And, at the end of the day, one of the things that John was saying, and I mean this, if you have a school board somewhere that bans half the books in the library, that's not a national emergency. It's certainly an emergency for that community, right? And by all means, I would encourage people of goodwill all over the country to join with anyone in that community to do whatever they could to help get those people out of office. But that community's got to deal with that issue. Right? We can't live in an era where politics is always someone else's business, someone else's concern, right? We have to have some honest discussions. Marjorie Taylor Greene's congressional district, those people are not pulling their weight collectively. Neither are the people in Lauren Boebert's district. Neither are the people in Paul Gosar's district. And it's not an issue of ideology. By all means, if you're a conservative Republican district, send the most conservative person. Don't send somebody who should be institutionalized, somebody who's reckless, somebody who's calling for civil war. You're not pulling your weight. So I think you need somebody who can talk honestly, tell people things they don't want to hear, have an adult conversation, and I think people would appreciate it. And there's a lot of indications out there and a lot of different metrics that suggest that would be the case, but we'll see. At the end of the day, Churchill had this observation that in a democracy, essentially people get the government they deserve. I don't think the American people deserve the government they have. And by that, I don't mean the administration. I mean the collective whole in its totality in this moment of time, from a broken campaign finance system, a redistricting system, a lack of representation, wholesale attack on voting rights, civil rights. And one of the things that we're seeing that I didn't see coming, but I should have seen coming because I knew enough about American history to know this. Every time there's been Black progress, there has been a fierce reaction and regression that has followed it. Happened in the 1920s, happened in the 1870s and the 1880s, and it's happening in part as a reaction to the Obama presidency. And so there's a fundamental question, right, that has to now be put forward, right, as a debating point that to me supersedes everything. And it's this. The question on the table is, are all of us, in fact, at long last created equally, endowed by a creator with inalienable rights that include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Yay or nay? I'm on the yay side of that question. Donald Trump and others are on the nay side of that question. And the problem for Republicans is that there's a lot of Republican leaders who are on the yay side pretending to be on the nay side because they've been intimidated by the extremists, which makes them a coward, which is as bad as an extremist. So beset by cowardice, cynicism, and extremism, you have this broken institution that won't be remedied until you have a reformer that emerges, and you don't have reformers that emerge from broken institutions out of victory. That happens out of defeat. So that party has to be beaten by somebody and something that can offer better. And politics starts with being able to talk and teach basic economics.
So, Steve, who might those somebodies be?
You don't know yet. You have when I look at candidates, a Gretchen Whitmer is an attractive national candidate. Tim Ryan would be an attractive national candidate. Mitch Landrieu could be an attractive national candidate. There are scores of candidates, right? Potential. I think if you're a member of Congress, you're Abigail Spanberger, you want to run, take a shot. You're certainly qualified. At the end of the day, a race for president is a character test where you're going to see somebody go out there, do they mean it? And so, I don't know the answer to the question because I haven't seen the person yet who means it. When you look at somebody like Gavin Newsom, for example, in California, I think Gavin is an interesting example. State of California is going to spend $15 billion dealing with its homeless problem. Now, did Gavin Newsom cause that homeless problem? He did not. Homeless problem in California has been building through failed leadership for 25 years. $15 billion to fix it. Now, he could ignore it, pretend it's not happening, but he's choosing not to do that. So he's taking a big risk. Now, would you prefer, and would I suspect that, would he prefer that money goes into the educational system? Of course he would. But we have to make decisions about dealing with real issues that are worsening and will get worse at the advent of this age of machine learning, artificial intelligence, so on and so forth. So how do we think about the social welfare net? How do we make it more efficient? How do we make it more competent? How does government deliver a service as efficiently as a private sector institution can? Do they have the technology they need? Do they have the training they need? Do they have the systems they need? So you really need somebody who's an innovator, who's an entrepreneur, who understands democracy, who understands America, who understands the history of the country, our role in the world, and this moment in time, and is able to project out, how do we remain the most powerful nation with the most amount of opportunity that brings peace and prosperity and domestic tranquility for our children? That's what the job of politics is. It's not to impose, it's to compromise. And it's to go to places, whether it's a state capitol, a county seat, a town council, the Congress, and to work out complexity in good faith and an open hand in a reasonable way with other people who are doing the same. And when people take a flyer on that and rather engage in performance art, insanity as a vocation, conspiracy as an occupation, time to say enough. And that's this moment that we're in. There's no place to back up to from the place we're at if you're on the pro-democracy side. You can't accommodate a neo-Nazi. You can't accommodate a violent Proud Boy. You can't accommodate an election denier, because the price of the accommodation is the loss of democracy. The price of accommodation with these people is what you've seen happen to the Republican Party. That's what accommodation to all of this looks like. And that's terrible for America and American democracy.
Throw out some names then. Who's of interest to you?
Ro Khanna from California. He's not overly well known. He's his mid-40s. He's a congressman from Silicon Valley. I don't always agree with Ro on every issue, but I can tell you that he's deep. He wrote a book a year or so ago about the economy and the next economy and where we're headed. And Jürgen Habermas blurbed it, one of the greatest thinkers in the world. And the bottom line is that Ro Khanna is a very, very deep thinker. And he's somehow figured out how to do that in politics. And so I think he's very interesting. I'll give you a Republican I think is interesting, Nancy Mace from down in the Carolinas. I certainly don't agree with her on a lot of things. But I can tell you that, every once in a while, she will really deviate from the pattern and bring an element of seriousness to it, which is, I think, very hard in the Republican Congressional Caucus at this point. And I can run down a list of a lot of people. Like Steve, I do look for people that are younger than me, who I think are the ones who are getting it right. And as I look at state legislatures around the country, I see a ton of people rising up who came into politics by different routes. My state representative in Madison is a chef. She was a restaurateur, and when the pandemic hit, her restaurant wasn't operating the same way. Everything was all blown apart, so she decided to run for the legislature, and she's turned out to be a brilliant legislator, Francesca Hong. What I will say to you is that we are now in a transition period, as Steve well points out. We've got an 80-year-old president. One of his likely challengers is almost 80. We have to move to this next place. And as we move to this next place, the ideal thing would be not simply to move with the traditional political class, but to move with new types of political leaders and people who come from different spots and are frankly willing to be dramatically more blunt about what needs to happen in the country.